Mm. Everybody, it's Tim. It's great to be with you today in our journey through the Bible, one day at a time. Our reading for today was in Deuteronomy, chapters 8, 9, and 10. You know, the New Testament tells us that God chastens every son that he loves. He does that for a purpose because his desire ultimately is that we would be conformed to the image of Christ. And the chastening that we go through, our times in the wilderness, are part of the process that God uses to bring about that change in our lives until we are conformed to the image of Christ as we stand before Him in heaven. But we see in chapter 8 of Deuteronomy, the Lord led people through the wilderness for a purpose. He was not just wasting their time for 40 years. It should have been a 2-week walk, but they were there in the desert because God was using that experience to humble them and test them to see if they would obey his commands. Think about that for a minute. You know, God had people be there in this howling desert, it's called, so they can be humble and so that their hearts can be revealed. You know, this is one of the reasons why God allows us to go through life's difficulties and why he allows suffering and he allows times of testing. We need to be humbled when we're in the wilderness. Spiritually, we need to be tested. Remember the book of Job and all that he went through as he lost everything. He lost his children. He lost his health. But that was not for nothing. That was for a purpose. God saw that here was a man who was ready for a deeper relationship with me, a greater walk with me. And this is the means that God used to bring that about. You see in verse 3 that God directed this time in the wilderness. It says, He humbled thee, and He suffered thee to hunger. God was in charge that whole time. They were hungry, not by accident. You know, God could have provided manna on day one, and they never would have known a day of hunger in that 40 years. But He allowed them to go through hunger, to humble them, to create a greater dependence on God. God's in control of Christians, even in their times of suffering. He rules over our grief in the wilderness. But He does that so we can learn. And you may ask, what does God want us to learn in this? Well, you notice the end of verse 3. It says that He might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. Hey, does that sound familiar to you? I hope so. When Jesus was in the desert for 40 days, he was there by God's will. It says the Spirit drove him in the wilderness. He was following God's lead, God the Father, there in the desert. And he was fasting for that 40 days. Now, when you go through a long period of fasting, you go through that period in the first few days where you are just really hungry and you're ready to eat everything in sight. But eventually you get to the place where that hunger subsides and it becomes much easier. But eventually you get to the place, and Jesus was there after 40 days, where the hunger returns. And when it returns, this is real hunger. You're starving, literally, when the hunger returns in that place. And that's where Jesus was after 40 years. He was starving. And that's when the devil thought that he would test Jesus, when he was at his weakest point with this great sin. Make some bread. There's some stones here. If you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. You can do it, can't you? Do you ever wonder what the great sin was in making bread? I'll tell you what it was. It's that God the Father had not led God the Son to that place yet. He would eventually. And Jesus just trusted the Father to take care of him until he got to that place where the Father would provide for him. That's why Jesus used this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 8 to counteract the devil. This passage is not talking about making bread. It's talking about receiving manna every day. But the principle is the same. Out of the mouth of the Lord, a man lives. By God's will, we live. That's why Jesus quoted this verse. He meant that we can trust in the promises that come out of God's mouth to provide for us. He was saying life is more than food, but even more than that. He was saying, I know that the Father is going to take care of me. God said that he would. Jesus did what Israel failed to do. He was willing to just wait on the promises of God, whether it was 40 days or 50 days, if it went that long. He was willing to wait on God and his provision. I wish Israel could have learned that lesson earlier, but that was part of what God was teaching them through this time in the wilderness. And God does that in our difficulties as well. You keep reading in this chapter, verse 5, for example, but we often think discipline is some kind of punishment for wrongdoing, but that's not the point of discipline. God allows the difficulties in our lives to be times of instruction and teaching and learning, just as parents allow their children to learn from decisions and from mistakes. A part of our discipline allows us to make some of our own mistakes so that we can know the Lord better and ultimately arrive at the place God desires for you more than anything else, to be conformed to the image of Christ. When you're going through difficulties in your life, I challenge you, let God do it. Trust him, and he'll bring you through it. You'll be stronger because of it. Well, stay with us in your reading tomorrow. Our reading in the Bible is in Deuteronomy 11, 12, and 13, those 3 chapters. So read those, think about those a little bit, then I'll be back with you again tomorrow with a thought that comes out of those chapters. See you then. Have a great day, everybody.